There was a woman in eastern Nebraska in the winter of 1887 who should have frozen to death. She had a half cord of cottonwood left in the yard, stacked under a piece of canvas that the wind had already pulled loose twice. The cabin she was living in had a cast-iron stove no bigger than a wash-basket, 2 windows with oilcloth where the glass should have been, and walls that let in enough cold air that a candle would flutter in the middle of the room on a still night. She was 34 years old. Her husband was 4 months dead. The nearest neighbour was 3 miles east, and he had his own problems. What she didn't know yet, what she couldn't know, because he never told her, was that beneath the dirt floor of the barn 30 feet from her front door, her husband had spent the better part of 4 years hiding the most improbable insurance policy on the Nebraska prairie. 40 cords of seasoned white oak and shagbark hickory, cut and split and stacked in a sealed chamber 6 feet below the frost line, where no fire could reach it and no thief could see it, and no amount of Dakota wind could touch it. She found it while she was clearing the barn to sell the horse. This is the story of what she found, how it worked, and what it tells us about the winter that nearly killed the American West. The summer of 1886 arrived dry. Settlers who had been on the plains for any length of time recognized the signs, though many of the newer arrivals did not. Some of the older ones watched the birds and said nothing, because saying it out loud felt like calling it in. Beavers along the Loup River were cutting and caching more wood than anyone had seen. Snowy owls came down from Canada 3 weeks ahead of schedule. The grass on the upland went brown and stayed brown before July was out. Ella Morse had been living on her claim in Colfax County, Nebraska, 12 miles north of Schuyler on the east bank of Shell Creek, since the spring of 1883, when her husband George had filed under the Homestead Act and paid $2 for the filing fee. George was from central Ohio, the son of a man who had farmed the same quarter section for 40 years, and he had come west the way a lot of Ohio men did in the early 80s. With a head full of land prices and a practical working knowledge of soil and timber that the Iowa and Dakota men sometimes lacked, George Morse was not an educated man in the formal sense. He had gone through the 5th reader in a one-room school near Circleville and could work numbers well enough to know when a merchant was cheating him. What he had instead of book learning was the kind of mechanical patience that makes a man good at problems. When something was broken, he did not get frustrated. He looked at it until he understood it, and then he fixed it. When he had a problem he could not solve immediately, he held it in the back of his mind for months or sometimes years until the answer presented itself. George Morse had survived the hard winter of 1880 and 1881. He had been in Dakota Territory then, working for a cattle outfit near Yankton, and he had watched the first blizzard hit on the 15th of October, 1880, before the coal had even been ordered. He had spent that winter watching men burn furniture, burn fence posts, burn anything that would catch, because the snow came on 47 of 59 days between January and February of 1881. And the railroads stopped running and the coal wagons stopped coming and the supply train out of Yankton was buried under 17 feet of drifted snow somewhere between 2 stations that were only 9 miles apart. He remembered the sound, a man-made burning a chair he had built himself because there was nothing else left. He came to Nebraska 2 years later with a specific idea about winter that most of his new neighbors did not share, and no interest in discussing it. By September of 1883, George had built a cabin of 12-inch cottonwood logs, chinked with a mixture of clay and dry grass, 14 by 22 feet on the inside. He had also made a decision that struck every man who heard about it as either foolish or pointless. He had started digging under his barn. The barn itself was 32 by 44 feet large for a homestead claim, but George had sized it for the animals he planned to have, not the animals he had. He dug by himself with a long-handled spade and a short-handled grubbing hoe, working in the early mornings before the day's other work began. He told Ella it was for drainage. When neighbours asked, he said he was putting in a root cellar to keep the seed potatoes cool in summer. Neither explanation was the whole truth. What George was building, over the course of 4 winters and 4 summers, was a chamber. 9 feet deep at its lowest point, sided with dry-laid limestone blocks he had sledged from an outcrop 3 miles south. Floored with clean creek gravel 4 inches deep for drainage, roofed with a framework of heavy cottonwood timber, topped with packed clay, and 6 inches of sod. The entrance was a low doorway cut into the north foundation of the barn, concealed behind the grain storage area where no casual visitor would look. The total floor space, when he was done, was a little over 900 square feet, about the size of a modest cabin. He lined the walls with planks to keep the earth back. He drove 3 clay tile ventilation pipes up through the sod roof to keep the air from going stale. He put the floor gravel in over 2 feet of crushed stone for drainage so that groundwater could not pool. Then he began filling it. The wood came from the timber belt along Shell Creek and the Loop River to the south white oak and shagbark hickory mostly, with some white ash mixed in. George would cut and split during the slow months, haul the green wood to the chamber in his wagon, stack it tightly on top of the gravel floor on a network of small rails he had built to keep the wood off the stone, and leave the ventilation pipes open to season it. He started in the fall of 1884. He worked at it the way he worked at everything, not frantically but steadily, the way a man does a job he has already decided will get done. By the summer of 1887, if anyone had thought to measure it, the chamber held 40 cords of wood that had been stacked underground for at least 2 full years. The hickory had been down there for 3. Shagbark hickory, properly seasoned, delivers 27.7 million BTU per cord. White oak runs 25.7 million. At 40 cords of mixed stock, the chamber held somewhere between 1 billion and 1,100 million BTU of stored heat enough to run a cast iron box stove, at its standard efficiency of about 30%, through 2 full plains winters without touching bottom. George did not know those numbers. He would not have used those words. What he knew was that the hard winter had lasted 7 months, and a man who went into it with less than 40 cords and a closed stove was going to be in serious trouble by February. He died in August of 1887, not from the cold was still coming, but from a burst appendix, 3 days after the pain started, before anyone could get a doctor from Schuyler. He was 41 years old. He had told Ella nothing about the chamber except that it was a root cellar and the ventilation pipes on the barn roof were for air circulation. She had not asked many questions because George was not a man who invited them on the subject of his building projects. When he said a thing was taken care of, it was taken care of, and that had always been enough. It was not enough now. By October of 1887, Ella had 200 pounds of salt pork in the cellar, 40 pounds of dried beans, 120 pounds of flour, and a half cord of green cottonwood stacked against the south wall of the cabin. She had sold George's ox team in September to cover the mortgage payment to the land office. She had kept the mare because she needed the mare to haul wood and water, but she was considering selling the mare too if she could not find another way to raise $23 before the 1st of December. She was not afraid in the way people sometimes imagine frontier women were afraid, not shaking, not crying at the walls. She was doing arithmetic. She knew what she had, and she knew what a Nebraska winter required, and she knew the gap between them, and she was working the problem the way George had always worked problems, steadily, looking at each part of it. The cottonwood was the worst part. Green cottonwood burns poorly under the best conditions. It smokes, it hisses, it spits sap water onto iron and stone, and it delivers about 13.5 million BTU per cord when dry, which green cottonwood is not. Wet cottonwood delivers perhaps half that in usable heat, because the fire spends so much energy boiling the moisture out of the wood before it can generate real heat. Every pound of water in a log requires 1,200 BTU just to evaporate. A cord of green cottonwood can hold 500 pounds of water or more. The stove works, the wood fights it. Half a cord of green cottonwood, burned in a small cast-iron box stove at 30% efficiency, would keep the cabin above freezing for perhaps 3 weeks at -10 degrees Fahrenheit. At my 30 degrees Fahrenheit, which Nebraska had hit before and would hit again, 3 weeks became perhaps 2. Ella had done this math in her head without knowing the BTU figures or the efficiency percentages. She had done it by watching how fast the stove ate wood and feeling how cold the cabin still got. And the answer she arrived at was that there was not enough wood, not nearly enough. She was planning to burn furniture by Christmas. She had already identified which pieces: the wooden bench along the east wall first, then the spare chairs. She had calculated, roughly, that the bench and 3 chairs, plus the half cord of cottonwood, would take her to perhaps late January if the winter was ordinary. If the winter was what some of the older settlers said it was going to be, and the beavers and the owls and the dry summer all said the same thing, the old ones said she would run out of fuel in February. On a morning in the 3rd week of October, with the temperature at 18 degrees and a hard crust of early snow on the ground, Ella went to the barn to check on the mare and found her showing signs of lameness in the left foreleg. She stood in the barn for a long time looking at the horse. A lame horse would not sell for enough to cover the December mortgage, and she could not haul wood or water without the mare. And if the mare died or had to be put down before spring, she did not know how she would manage the spring planting. She went back to the cabin and sat at the table. She had a letter from George's brother in Circleville, Ohio, suggesting she sell the claim and come east, and she had read it 3 times and set it aside each time. She had no interest in selling. George had built this place 1 log and 1 stone at a time over 4 years, and he had died on this ground, and she intended to hold it. After a while, she got up and went back to the barn. She had decided to clear out the storage area in the north corner, the grain bins and the old harness frames and the broken equipment George had never gotten around to mending, and make room to stable the mare closer to the barn's interior wall, where it would be warmer, to rest the leg. She moved the grain bins first, dragging them on the dirt floor, raising a cloud of chaff and old dust that caught the thin October light coming through the single east-facing window. When she moved the last bin, she found a door. It was set into the stone foundation wall about 18 inches off the floor, framed in heavy planks, hung on iron pintles George had forged himself. It was 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall. A simple iron latch held it shut. It had been behind the grain bins since the day the grain bins were put in, which was before Ella had arrived at this claim, and she had never seen it. She stood looking at it for a moment. Then she lifted the latch and swung it open. The smell was not what she expected. It was not earth, not rot, not the damp blackness of underground spaces that have gone wrong. It was dry, almost warm. And underneath the mineral smell of stone and the faint sweetness of old wood, there was something she recognized from the woodlot back in Ohio, where she had grown up, the particular dense, slightly nutty smell of cut hardwood that has been sitting long enough to lose all its moisture. She found a lantern, lit it, and went in. The chamber George had built was 9 feet high at the peak of the arched timber ceiling, 9 feet deep at the back wall, and 40 feet wide. The limestone walls were fitted tightly enough that only a thin line of mortar showed between the courses. The gravel floor was dry, with a slight slope toward a drainage channel along the south wall. The ventilation pipes let thin columns of light through from above, illuminating dust motes and the side grain of cut wood stacked floor to ceiling on both sides. Ella stood in the entrance with the lantern raised. The wood was stacked in rows, each row separated from the next by 6-inch spacers George had nailed in place to allow air to circulate between the faces of the stacks. The pieces were split to a uniform size 4-inch splits, roughly, and the end grain faced outward on both sides of every row, which is the correct way to stack wood for drying, because moisture escapes primarily through the end grain. The stacks were tight and plumb and measured. There was not a piece of rotted wood visible anywhere. She walked the length of the chamber, touching the wood with one hand, the lantern in the other. The face of a split piece of white oak has a specific colour when it has been properly seasoned, a pale, tangent grey, like old bone, with none of the darker streaking that indicates moisture. The pieces she touched were that colour. The hickory at the far end was darker, the way hickory always is, with its characteristic layered bark still on some of the rounds at the bottom of the furthest stack. She came back to the entrance and sat down on a piece of limestone that had been left near the door, the lantern between her feet. George had not told her. She did not know whether to be angry or not. She had decided, by the time she walked back to the house, that she did not have the luxury of being angry. What George had actually accomplished, though neither he nor Ella would have described it in these terms, was to exploit one of the most reliable thermal facts about the Earth itself. Below a certain depth, the ground maintains a constant temperature year-round. That depth varies by location. In Nebraska, the frost line is typically 48 inches 4 feet down, which is the depth required by building codes in Omaha. George's chamber floor was at 9 feet, well below that. At 9 feet in Colfax County, Nebraska, the ground temperature holds at approximately 52 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit through every month of the year. It does not rise to summer heat. It does not drop to winter cold. The sun's heat and the winter's cold both travel downward through the soil slowly enough that by the time they reach 9 feet, they are gone, smoothed away by the enormous thermal mass of the earth above. This is a measurable physical property of the earth that anyone with a thermometer and a long enough pipe can verify today, and which the U.S. Geological Survey and every state extension service in the Midwest have documented in detail. Dig 6 feet down in North Dakota in January, and the ground is 45 degrees. Dig the same hole in Kansas, and it is closer to 54. In Nebraska, it is right in the middle. What this meant for George's wood was simple and important. The wood he had stacked in that chamber was never exposed to the temperature swings that destroy surface-stored wood. It was never wet by rain and dried by sun in repeated cycles. It was never frozen and thawed. Freeze-thaw cycling is one of the primary mechanisms by which wood degrades. Ice crystals form inside the cell walls, expand and break the fibers apart from the inside. None of that happened to the wood in George's chamber, because the temperature in that chamber never dropped below 50 degrees. There was a complication. Underground spaces are humid. The natural relative humidity 9 feet below the surface in Nebraska runs 85 to 95% year-round. Wood exposed to 90% humidity for long enough will absorb moisture from the air and rise in moisture content, the reverse of seasoning. George had addressed it with the ventilation pipes, 3 of them, 2 inches in diameter, rising from different points in the chamber ceiling through the barn floor and out through the sod roof. On dry days or on winter days when the cold outside air was drier than the chamber air, a slow convective exchange would occur, the heavy humid air sinking and the drier outside air entering through the pipes and carrying moisture up and out. It was not a controlled system, it was a passive one, but it worked well enough over 4 years that the wood Ella found showed no sign of decay and no visible mold. For the wood-boring beetles and carpenter ants and other insects that routinely devastate surface-stored wood in the summer months, their activity is temperature-dependent. Most wood-boring insects stop developing entirely below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Some cease all activity below 55. In a chamber that maintained 52 to 54 degrees year-round, an insect would remain in a state of arrested development, never dying but never eating. The wood George had put in that chamber was, 4 years later, in better condition than most above-ground wood piles that had been sitting through Nebraska summers. The seasoning itself had continued underground. Wood seasons by releasing bound moisture through its cell walls, primarily through the end grain. The ventilation George had engineered moved air slowly across the end grain of every stack. 4 years of slow, steady airflow through a 5-2-degree chamber had brought the moisture content of the oak and hickory down to somewhere between 14% and 18%, within the range that stove manufacturers then and now consider optimal for burning. At 15% moisture content, a cord of white oak delivers approximately 25 million usable BTU. At 20%, it delivers perhaps 22 million. Either way, it was far superior to the half cord of green cottonwood sitting in the Nebraska wind outside Ella's door. She went back to the chamber that afternoon with a measuring tape that had belonged to George and paced off the dimensions of the stacks. She counted rows. She did some arithmetic on the back of the letter from Ohio. 40 cords, give or take 2. She sat down again on the limestone by the entrance, with the measuring tape in her lap and the letter in her hand. And she thought about her husband for a while. November came in cold and dry. The older settlers said the same thing they had been saying since September, and the weather bore them out. On November 8, a front moved through Colfax County that pushed the temperature from 28 degrees at dawn to 6 below zero by late afternoon. The wind came from the northwest at 30 miles per hour sustained, which dropped the felt temperature to something below 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The mare's water trough froze solid in 4 hours. The south window of the cabin, the one with glass in it, cracked from the bottom corner to the top latch. Ella had moved 6 cords of the chamber wood up to the barn proper and stacked it along the interior south wall. 10 feet from the stove, she had relocated from the cabin to a position against the cabin's east wall, where it would heat the room more evenly. She had also done something her neighbour, Garrett Volker, who stopped by in the first week of November to check on her, found completely inexplicable. She had started cutting and splitting additional wood, a full day's work for a woman alone, using the long crosscut saw and the splitting maul from George's tool shed, and she was stacking it against the outside of the cabin's north wall, floor to rafter height, 2 feet thick, running the full 22-foot length of the north wall and wrapping around both corners to cover the first 4 feet of the east and west walls. Garrett Volker stood in the yard, looking at this. "What do you aim to do with all that wood on the outside of your house?" he said. Ella said it was to cut the wind. Volker had been in Nebraska since 1875 and knew a great deal about wind. He looked at the stacked wood for a while. He said a woman living alone would use up half her fuel supply, keeping it decorative like that, and freeze because she had nothing left to burn. Ella said she had enough wood. Volker looked at the half cord of green cottonwood still stacked under the canvas, which was the only wood he knew about, and said nothing else on the subject. He rode home with the particular expression of a man who has decided not to be responsible for another person's choices. What Ella was building was not decorative and was not waste. It was a dead air wall. Wood stacked tightly against a cabin wall does several things simultaneously. It creates a layer of material between the exterior wall and the wind. Wind chill the felt temperature that makes -10 degrees Fahrenheit feel like -40 degrees Fahrenheit is a physical reality, not a figure of speech. Wind strips heat from surfaces by carrying the warmed air away from the surface faster than the surface can reheat it. A wall of stacked firewood 2 feet thick, even with the gaps between the pieces, slows the wind to near zero at the surface of the cabin wall. The wind cannot reach the wall cannot lose heat to air that is not moving. The wood itself has an R value of roughly 1 per inch of thickness. 24 inches of stacked oak delivers approximately R24 of additional insulation on top of whatever the log walls themselves provide. This was not a technique Ella invented. Frontier families had stacked wood against exterior walls for warmth for as long as there had been a frontier. What was different in Ella's situation was that she had enough wood to do it properly, not a token stack against one corner, but a full perimeter treatment of the most exposed walls. The north wall alone, covered 2 feet deep the full length, would cut the cabin's heat loss through that face by more than half on a 30-mile-per-hour wind day. The fuel cost of building this wall was not the wood that would eventually be burned from it. The wood would all burn eventually. She was moving wood from the chamber to the cabin wall, and then from the cabin wall to the stove, in a sequence that served both purposes: insulation first, fuel second. Nothing was wasted. The wood kept its heat value, whether it was in the wall or in the stove. Garrett Volker came by again in the second week of November with his wife Marta, who had brought a crock of pickled beets and wanted to see how Ella was managing. Marta Volker stood in the yard looking at the wood wall, which was now 5 feet high on the north face and turning the corner to the east, and said it was a clever idea. Garrett was looking at the barn and had noticed that the door to the north foundation wall was no longer concealed. He asked what was back there. Ella said her husband had built a root cellar. Marta Volker asked why she was pulling firewood out of a root cellar. Ella said George had used it to season the wood. He liked to keep his best wood out of the weather. Marta nodded as if this were a reasonable thing for a man to do. Garrett looked at the stacks of pale oak and hickory coming out of the barn and thought about it and said nothing. The winter that came for Nebraska and the Dakotas in 1887 and 1888 was not one storm. It was a state of affairs. November brought sustained cold that did not break. December added ice. January brought the storm. On the 12th of January, 1888, the morning was warm, deceptively, dangerously warm. The temperature at Huron in Dakota Territory climbed into the 40s. Children across the Dakotas and Nebraska went to school without their heavy coats. Some teachers let children outside to play in the unaccustomed warmth. The front hit the northern plains at midday. At Crete, Nebraska, the temperature fell 18 degrees in 3 minutes. Not 18 degrees over the course of an afternoon, but 18 degrees in 3 minutes, recorded by the local weather observer. At Huron, Dakota Territory, the temperature dropped from 20 degrees Fahrenheit at noon to minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-afternoon, and continued falling to minus 27 degrees Fahrenheit by nightfall. Winds sustained at 30 miles per hour drove snow fine enough to sift through closed windows and keyhole plates and the gaps between floorboards. The visibility went to 0 within minutes. Children who had been playing outside at noon were dead by 3 in the afternoon, frozen to death within sight of their school doors, unable to find their way back through the whiteout. 235 people died. Some estimates place the number as high as 500. Ole Oleson Tisland, a man of 70, was found frozen 12 feet from his front door near Brookings in Dakota Territory. A woman in Custer County wrote in her account of the storm that she and a neighbor widow burned old chairs to stay warm because neither of them had fuel. The cold that followed the storm set a record that still stands. On the 14th of January, 1888, 2 days after the blizzard, the United States Signal Corps station at Fort Keogh in Montana recorded minus 65 degrees Fahrenheit. In Colfax County, Nebraska, the temperatures were not as extreme, but they were enough. The thermometer outside Garrett Volker's barn read 28 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of January 14. By Volker's account, his cast-iron stove, a good one, a large one he had paid $32 for, could not keep the interior of his cabin above 40 degrees Fahrenheit on that morning, even running at full draw with good wood. He burned 7/8 of a cord in 24 hours, trying to hold 50 degrees Fahrenheit inside his walls. He burned through his wood supply in 19 days. His neighbor to the north, a man named Fasig, who had come out from Indiana in 1885, had been confident in October that his 12 cords of mixed cottonwood and ash would see him through. Cottonwood, even dry cottonwood, delivers about 13.5 million BTU per cord, roughly half what oak delivers. Ash is better, around 23 million BTU per cord seasoned. Fazig's mixed supply averaged something closer to 17 million BTU per cord. 12 cords at that rate, run through a cast iron stove at 30% efficiency, delivered about 61 million BTU of useful heat. A 500 square foot cabin losing heat at minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit needed roughly 45,000 British thermal units per hour to maintain 60 degrees Fahrenheit inside. Fazig's 12 cords, used efficiently, would last about 45 days. The winter was not 45 days. By the last week of January, Fazig was burning fence posts. By February, he had sent his wife and children to stay with her parents in Schuyler and was burning the floorboards of the back room to stay alive alone in the front. He sold his claim the following spring and went back to Indiana. Volker's situation was less desperate than Fazig's because Volker was more resourceful. But by the second week of February, he had exhausted his wood supply and was burning corn cobs and dried cow dung and a cord and a half of green elm. He had cut the previous fall when he knew it was too green and kept anyway because he had nothing else. Green elm at that moisture content delivers perhaps 9 million BTU per cord in usable heat. It also fills a cabin with acrid smoke. On the 14th of February 1888, Garrett Volker hitched his horse to his sled and drove 3 miles through minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, whether to Ella Morse's claim to see if she had wood to sell or trade. He found her yard clear, no debris, no abandoned equipment, no drifted snow piled against the cabin door the way it drifted against every other door in the county that winter. The path from the cabin to the barn had been shoveled since the last snowfall, recent shoveling, the cut edges of the path still sharp and white. There was smoke from the cabin chimney, a steady thin column of it that meant a moderate fire, not a desperate one. He knocked on the cabin door. Ella opened it. The interior of the cabin, when the door swung inward, hit him like stepping from a January street into a summer kitchen. He stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. The temperature inside the cabin was somewhere above 65 degrees Fahrenheit, comfortably, solidly above, the kind of warmth that allows a person to sit in ordinary indoor clothing without a shawl or a blanket. The cast-iron stove against the east wall was running a moderate fire, not at full draw. The wood beside it was pale and dry and split fine, and it was oak. Volker asked if she had wood to spare. Ella said she did. She sold him 2 cords at a price that was fair without being generous. She made the same arrangement with 3 other neighbours between February and March, 2 cords to the Fazigs before they left, 1 cord to the Hendersons at the section line, and a full 4 cords to the Schuyler merchant who came out in person in late February with a wagon and $300 in paper money, having heard from the Volkers that there was a widow on Shell Creek with good hardwood who was not running short. By the time the snow began pulling back from the south-facing slopes in late March of 1888, Ella Morse had sold 9 cords of wood from George's chamber at prices ranging from $12 to $18 per cord, a total of roughly $140. She had used 11 cords herself through the winter, running her stove at moderate draw and keeping the cabin at a temperature that was reasonable rather than merely survivable. She had 19 cords remaining in the chamber, plus the 3 cords still stacked against the cabin wall. She had made her December mortgage payment. She had made the March one too. After the winter broke, Garrett Volker came by again, not for wood this time. He sat at Ella's table and drank the coffee she put in front of him and asked about the chamber. He had been thinking about it since February, since the moment the warm air from her cabin had hit him in the doorway, and he wanted to understand it. Ella told him about the depth. She told him what George had said about the frost line and the constant temperature below it, the 5-2-degree earth that never changed, and she told him about the ventilation pipes and the drainage gravel and the end grain stacking. She did not explain it in those terms exactly, because she had not known all of it when she found it. She had figured out the ventilation and the drainage from walking the chamber. The reason for the depth she had worked out later, when she noticed that the temperature inside the chamber in late January, when the outside air was 22 degrees Fahrenheit and the barn interior was barely above 30 degrees Fahrenheit, was 51 degrees. She had taken the temperature with a dairy thermometer she kept for her cream cans. 51 degrees in late January, and the chamber temperature had not moved more than 3 degrees from where it had been in October. The reason is the same now as it was then. Heat travels through soil at a rate of about 1 foot per month. The summer's warmth reaches 6 feet down in approximately 6 months, arriving as winter begins and departing as summer returns, in a cycle that irons out all extremes at depth. The winter's cold penetrates downward at the same rate. 4 feet down, the frost line typically marks where the winter's cold eventually reaches. Below that, the seasonal temperature swings grow smaller. At 9 feet, they are nearly gone. The earth at that depth holds its temperature the way a root cellar holds its cool, not because it is cold, but because it is massive, and mass is slow to change. George Morse had understood this without having the vocabulary for it. He had felt the temperature of the earth at depth, probably while digging post holes, or digging out a flooded root cellar, or some other commonplace piece of farm work, and he had asked himself why, and held the question in the back of his mind, and eventually arrived at a use for it. Volker asked how much wood it would take to fill the chamber again. Ella said she calculated about 42 cords for a full load, and that she had spoken with a timber cutter on the Loop River who would deliver split hardwood at $8 a cord if she committed to 10 cords or more. She had committed to 25. Volker said that was a great deal of wood. Ella said she knew what a bad winter cost. There is a note worth adding here about what happened to the settlements in the year after the school children's blizzard of the 12th of January, 1888. The storm killed at minimum 235 people across Dakota Territory, Nebraska, and Minnesota. The exact number is still debated, with some county records suggesting the final count was higher than 500 when the deaths of isolated homesteaders were tallied in the spring. The cold wave that followed the storm, the -65 degrees Fahrenheit at Fort Keogh on January 14, the -43 degrees Fahrenheit at Bismarck on February 1 and again on February 12, sustained the crisis into late winter. The winter was also the final act in a disaster that had been building for 2 years. The big die-up of 1,886 and 1,887, the winter before Ella's winter, had already killed approximately 362,000 head of cattle in Montana alone. Theodore Roosevelt, who ran 2 ranches in the Badlands of Dakota Territory, lost somewhere between 60 and 65% of his cattle, representing roughly $50,000, most of what he had invested in the Badlands operation. He wrote to his sister Anna in April of 1887 and called it a perfect smash-up. He never returned to ranching as a primary occupation. The Badlands experience shaped his views on conservation and land stewardship for the rest of his career. Granville Stewart, who ran the Pioneer Cattle Company in Montana and was among the most prominent cattlemen on the northern plains, lost 72% of his herd. The Poudre Livestock Company in Colorado lost 2/3 of its cattle, a loss valued at $400,000. Montana's large-scale cattle operations collapsed from 58 companies operating in 1885 to 9 by 1888. The total financial losses across the plains from these back-to-back winters exceeded $20 million. None of these losses were caused by a single storm or a single temperature reading. They were caused by the same thing that nearly finished Fasig and strained Volker: inadequate preparation for a winter that matched what the oldest settlers and the animals had been signaling for months. The animals knew. The beavers knew. The owls knew. The problem was not a lack of signals. The problem was that reading those signals and acting on them far enough in advance, cutting wood in summer for the winter after next, digging a chamber that would take 4 years to fill, making decisions in 1883 for a crisis that would arrive in 1888 required a particular kind of mind, the kind that holds a problem for years without impatience. George Morse had that mind. He was dead before the winter he prepared for, and the preparation served his wife instead of himself, which is either a tragedy or a gift, depending on how you look at it. What the chamber George built exploited is not complicated, and it does not require unusual resources or specialized knowledge to understand. It requires only the willingness to think past this winter to the next one, and the one after that. Below the frost line, the Earth is a thermal battery. It absorbs the mean temperature of its region over years and decades and holds it, smoothing out the extremes. The frost line in Nebraska sits at 4 feet. At 9 feet, the temperature is effectively constant at 52 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit through every calendar month. Seasoned hardwood, properly stored at that temperature and kept from direct ground moisture by drainage, gravel and separation rails, holds its fuel value for years. The moisture in green wood, which can represent 30 to 50% of the wood's total weight, burns away as wasted heat before the wood begins to heat a room. Every pound of water in a log requires 1,200 British thermal units just to evaporate, heat that goes up the stovepipe instead of into the room. Seasoned oak at 15% moisture content delivers approximately 25 million BTU per cord through a cast iron stove at 30% efficiency. Green cottonwood at 50% moisture content delivers perhaps 6 to 7 million BTU in usable heat from the same stove. The difference between those two numbers is roughly the difference between a survivable winter and a dangerous one. 40 cords of seasoned white oak and shagbark hickory holds approximately 1 billion BTU of stored heat energy. Through a cast iron stove at 30% efficiency, running a 500 square foot cabin through 7 months of Nebraska winter at an average outside temperature of 10 degrees Fahrenheit, that supply provides roughly 288 million BTU of delivered heat, nearly double the approximately 151 million BTU the cabin actually needs. The remaining heat capacity is what allowed Ella to sell 9 cords to her neighbours and still end the winter with more than a third of the original supply intact. This is what George had calculated, not in those numbers and not with that vocabulary, but in the equivalent terms that a practical man who had survived the hard winter of 1880 to 1881 and spent 7 months watching men burn furniture would naturally work out for himself. More than enough is the only margin worth planning for. The schoolchildren's blizzard was later linked by historians to a chain of atmospheric events that began in August of 1883 with the eruption of Krakatoa. The volcano's ash clouds circled the globe at high altitude, reducing incoming solar radiation for nearly 5 years. Average temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped measurably from 1,883 through 1,888. The winters of 1880 to 1881, 1886 to 1887, and 1887 to 1888 were among the coldest in recorded plains history. And the clustering of extreme winters in that decade was not coincidence. The settlers who arrived on the plains in the early 1880s came into the tail end of a relatively mild period. The Homestead Act had been in force since 1862, and by the early 80s, a quarter to a third of all homestead claimants in Nebraska, Dakota Territory, Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana were single women widows, unmarried women, and women filing as heads of household. The Homestead Act made no distinction. A widow could file as readily as any man, and records show that women proved up their claims at rates equal to or exceeding men's rates. Mary Meyer, a German immigrant widow whose husband Philip died in 1861, became the first woman to file a homestead claim in Nebraska Territory. She filed on the 20th of January 1863, days after Daniel Freeman made the nation's first claim, and she proved up in 5 years, building a 16 by 2 6-foot house with cultivated acres, fruit trees, a well, and a chicken coop. She was illiterate. The filing clerks had to add an S before the printed he and change his to her on the standard form because no one had thought to print forms for women. She never remarried. She held the land. The record of single women homesteaders in that era is largely one of underestimated competence. The assumption among their male neighbors was frequently that a woman alone would not manage the work, that she would fail to prove up, fail to hold on through a bad winter, sell out or give up and go back east. The records do not bear this out. Women proved up at the same rate men did, and some historians argue their claims were better maintained, better built, better stocked, more carefully prepared, because the women understood they did not have the margin for improvisation that a man with a male neighbor network might have. Ella Morse proved up her claim in 1889. She was still on that ground in 1897, when the county plat map recorded her name on the same 160 acres George had filed for in 1883. She had expanded the cultivated acreage from 40 to 90. She had added a second milk cow. She had refilled George's chamber twice with wood from the Loop River timber belt. A standard cord of firewood measures 4 feet wide by 4 feet high by 8 feet long, 128 cubic feet of stacked volume. Of that volume, approximately 85 cubic feet is solid wood, and the rest is air between the pieces, depending on how tightly the wood is split and stacked. 40 cords occupy 5,120 cubic feet of space, a room roughly 9 feet high by 50 feet long by 11.5 feet wide, or any combination of dimensions that arrives at that volume. If you dug a hole 9 feet deep by 50 feet long by 12 feet wide in a Nebraska field today by hand, with a spade and a grubbing hoe, one man working it would take between 3 months and 6 months depending on the soil. The excavation alone, before any stonework or timberwork or floor gravel, would move approximately 130 tons of earth. George moved it a wheelbarrow at a time, over 3 winters. The wood he cut and split and hauled and stacked in that time represents perhaps 400 days of labor, spread over 4 years, in the hours left after the farm work was done. He told no one why. He may not have wanted to explain, or he may have thought the explanation would sound like the talk of a frightened man, and he was not a frightened man. He was a prepared one. There is a difference, and George Morse knew it. He did not live to see the winter he built for, but the winter came anyway, and the wood was there, and his wife was warm. If you dig 6 feet into the ground anywhere in the American Midwest today, in a field in Nebraska, in a pasture in Kansas, in a construction site in Dakota, and put a thermometer at the bottom, the reading will be somewhere between 48 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the region and the depth. It will read approximately the same number in January as it does in July. This is a property of the earth that has not changed since George Morse figured it out with a spade and a dairy thermometer, and it will not change. The settlers who survived the decade of storms in the 1880s were not harder than the ones who didn't, and they were not luckier. They were more patient. They made decisions in September for February, and in 1883 for 1888, and they held those decisions through years of ordinary weather that made the precautions seem unnecessary and even slightly absurd. The root cellar does nothing useful until the one winter when it saves everything. The extra wood in the barn floor does nothing until the winter Garrett Volker runs out. The ones who lasted were the ones who believed, in the absence of evidence, that the worst was coming and prepared for it anyway. George Morse believed it because he had seen it once. He spent the rest of his life making sure that when it came again, the people he cared about would not have to burn the furniture. Share project content, SHE. Nick, created by Yushi. Avoid these styles. These styles were used. Text 10 line STKs.